I'm Reverend Donna Riegel, and it's my pleasure to be here today. I'm so delighted. It's a beautiful day here in Lilydale, and as we first met, listening to the chimes reminds me of my very first visit here. I was taking some classes, and when my husband and I stayed at the hotel that night, and it was very quiet, and listening to the chimes as the wind blew against the building and just made it a very mystical and magical place. I've lived here now almost 17 years, and I feel the same way about it today as I did 17 years ago when I first came here. It's very, it's unusually pleasant, and I often just stop. There's not a day that I'm not grateful that I'm part of what Lilydale is. Okay. I'm delighted to meet with you today, and especially at the Angel House. When I first came here, when my husband and I were first made our decision to move to Lilydale, we actually were looking at this house because it was vacant at the time, and thought of buying it, only to find out that it had already been sold, and Shelley was just ready to move in at the same time. Watching everything that she's put together, she truly has made the Angel House an expression of what Lilydale is, and a visit to what Lilydale is. Because the house is laid out exactly like the house that I actually did buy, although that they restructured the rooms here, it always fascinates me when I come here and see how interesting each room is. Because Shelley is perhaps the most gracious person I know. Every time that I've visited with Shelley or came to a party here or have been at the Angel House, it's always one of those feelings of family and togetherness that happens, especially when you connect in with Lilydale, whether you're here for a workshop or whether you're living here. And it's a sense of being at home with family and being extremely comfortable. I was delighted when Loretta, you chose this room today for our talk, because Shelley has decorated it in Harry Potter kind of motif. And when the film first came out, I felt almost a cosmic connectionness, in the sense that my animal totem is the snowy owl, and their animal totem was the snowy owl, and over in the corner of the room sits a great big snowy owl, which when I left, I was working the detox unit at St. Peter's as a NRN CAC, which I'm an addiction specialist and a registered nurse, and my peers gave to me as a going away gift as I was moving to Lilydale a beautiful carved snowy owl for me to put in my reading room, which I now have in my reading room here in Lilydale. So again, you walk into the Angel House and it's that at-home feeling, and makes this room very special for me. This is Reverend Donna Riegel again, and I'm glad to be back with you. Life is extremely interesting. In sitting again in this room and finding myself here and finding myself working with Loretta today, I still become amazed with how did I get here. Life is certainly a spiritual journey, and when we say that we are physical beings on a spiritual journey in this world, finally I've reached that winter of my life when I can look back and see how it all came together. Having been, as a little girl, and I was always little, I came into this world at 4 pounds. And really struggled, I think at that time, or at least I've been told, although I have no recall of it, of struggling to survive. And in 1945, there were no incubators. But I've always been tiny, and I think as a child, the awareness of always being the littlest one. Even in grade school, and I remember my first grade teacher as well as I remember people today. Actually, sometimes I remember them better, but always being the youngest and the smallest one in my class, and so I kind of grew up with this sense of not being quite as big as everyone else. So it was in itself a journey. I found myself, in especially in my childhood, I was raised by a single parent. My mom raised my 2 sisters and myself on a minimum wage job back in a time when our world was entirely different. And I've often said of it today when I think about it that while we were very poor in many ways, we never knew it because we never lived that way. And I thank her today for all of the gifts that she gave me in understanding, and it was only by living it, and something I didn't figure out until years later, actually unfortunately years after she passed, how much she maintained our life in a style and in a fashion that truly we didn't realize what we didn't have because we had such richness in so many other things. As I reached my teenage years, things got a little bit more confusing. I was a little old lady in a young body. And again, I think I came into this world that way. There were questions. I remember when I was about 10 years old, and we had a friend who was a professor at Union College, and I was in this philosophical stage, if we want to call it that, but one of my questions is that if God is all there is and God is all good, then why are there starving people in the world? And this man looked at me and kind of rubbed his chin, and he said, that's a big question for a 10-year-old to ask. And it's just a way of thinking that and I truly did ponder it. I pondered it for a long time. So I don't know that there was ever a time that I wasn't connected to that spiritual understanding of what is this all about, or there has to be something greater than all of this. Teenage years, I became very intuitive, and of course at the time we all chuckled and laughed about it, and it was a bit of that do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do and laughing and teasing. They say that mediums and psychics are very sensitive, and I have to say that in my years between 13 and perhaps 16 or 17, being sensitive was probably, whether it was a personality defect or a personality trait, I'm not sure which, but I certainly was often told how very sensitive I was. Unfortunately, we can't be any different than we are. And learning to embrace my sensitivity and to use it in a positive and uplifting manner has been truly a lifelong journey in itself. But as a teenager, knowing who was on the other end of the phone, knowing what was going to happen, and truly I say today that ignorance is often bliss, because it's not easy when you know something and you're explaining it to people. One, nobody believes you, and secondly, there's just that whole sense of, I wish I didn't know it, I don't know what to do with this, did I cause it because I thought it, did I wish it to happen? It was a terribly confusing time for me. And I found myself almost wanting to tuck those kinds of feelings away or not share them. Fortunately, I had a girlfriend who was, if you will, as crazy as I was, so the two of us oftentimes shared a lot of what we were thinking or what was happening or what we thought was going to happen, and then we would validate each other and gave each other a lot of support. My mother, who was a very, very hardworking and stern German lady, didn't really want to deal an awful lot with what I thought might happen or what I where I was coming from. So I learned to kind of stay a little bit quiet about it at home. My grandma, however, who used to come to Lilydale, I didn't find out until years and years later with my father and my uncle, was in fact a very intuitive and very mediumistic lady, and was known to have read tea leaves. So I come from that background of having a grandma who truly understood the mystic part. Unfortunately, when I was 10, they moved to Florida, so I didn't have the opportunity to have the association with her that I can't help but think today would have been extremely important. However, in just knowing that I was somewhat like her, I found a great deal of comfort. And of course, I don't have to tell you, in my reading room I have a little statue of a lady pouring a teacup, and I have it hanging underneath a beautiful housewarming prayer that she hand embroidered in Hungarian, and I have that up right where I do my readings. So I stay very connected to that very special feeling. I was always fascinated with my grandmother's connection, and actually it was my uncle after my grandmother passed, and I had found the prayer, and my Aunt Charlotte, who's her daughter naturally, gave me the embroidered cloth that she had made with the prayer on it, and I asked my uncle to translate it for me because I don't speak the language. And as he translated it for me, he started to sing in the garden. And this was right after my first, again, the synchronicity of things. There's a divine order that we can never explain, but I had already come to Lilydale for my first workshops the summer before. And as he started to sing in the garden, I kind of almost jumped back and looked at him, and he said, well, my mom used to take your dad and I to this place from Pittsburgh, outside of Pittsburgh, and they always sang in the garden. And in discovering it, I was making, I had made my first trip to Lilydale and talked to him about Lilydale, and I said, oh, that's where we used to go. So I was fascinated to find out that she had brought my father and uncle here, and it was through that prayer that this part of the family came out. It wasn't discussed much when I was a kid, other than that, Grandma, my mother referred to it was a holy roller as far as she was concerned, but she truly was very lighthearted about it. Having been raised very Catholic, and because my grandmother, as she came from Hungary back in around 1922, my Uncle Chuck was born in Hungary, my father was born here in this country, and she wanted so to be American that the children weren't allowed to speak the language, which is why none of us speak them. Although most of her culture, her cooking, and Grandma's flair, her color, she was just so Hungarian, and I was always fascinated with her, and her very distinct accent. Needless to say, the Hungarian cooking, and because my mom didn't know how to cook when she married my father, my mother cooks mostly Hungarian because Grandma taught her how to cook. So I was raised on a diet of very rich Hungarian food, which I still overindulge in and really enjoy today. But when they moved here, my grandmother, who I understand was actually Orthodox by religion, raised her. My grandfather was Catholic and from Budapest. So my father was raised as Catholic, and my mother was a nice Catholic girl, so we were raised as Catholic. Just about at 15, as I was going through this very sensitive stage, and I surely was a handful for my mother, we had relocated back to Pittsburgh from the Albany-Schenectady area where I had grown up, and I was quite verbal, and my Nana's response, my mother's mother's response to this was to send me off to boarding school, and it was supposed to be punishment. So they sent me to Holy Ghost Academy outside of Sewickley, Pennsylvania. And the strange thing was, I was so in my element. Oh my goodness, I absolutely loved it. I wanted to become a postulate. My mother, who had two French nun aunts that were both sisters in the Catholic religion, or nuns, had decided that that definitely was never going to happen. And then shortly after, she wasn't financially able to keep me in school. But when I got there, there was a piece of me that was so completely comfortable with kneeling on the floor in a very disciplined life. And as I said, I was just a student at the, actually my first year of high school, so it would have been 10th grade at Holy Ghost Academy, but I would have gladly been if I could have been a postulate and thought truly of becoming a nun. There was a little catch, though. I was already going steady, quote unquote, with a young man who was in the service, so I had a little conflict of interest between being a nun or not being a nun. But the life in itself, the meditation, they didn't call it that. It was time of prayer, and the simplicity of the life, and that strong connection to a spiritual sense. I truly found myself, as I said, in my own element, and that there was something that, it was a passionate kind of love that you can't explain. So shortly after, I was only there for about 6 months, and my mother, as I said, financially couldn't afford to keep me there, and she moved back to the Albany-Schenectady area, so I went back to high school in Schenectady, and then got married at 16 and a half years old. My boyfriend, who was in the service at the time, had gotten out of the service, and so for my 16th birthday present, he gave me an engagement ring, and so here I was engaged at 16 and still in high school, wanting to get married, and of course my mother was very opposed to this young marriage. However, we did get married the following fall in November, and off I went to be all grown up, because I just couldn't wait to grow up fast enough. By the time I was 20, I had 3 children. Then I found out where children came from, and I decided to stop doing that for a while, because 3 children at 20 years old was plenty. So I truly found myself, and I say today as I look back at it, as a kid raising kids. But again, there was a piece of me, that little old lady who was inside this very young child, that I truly embraced and worked, and I say worked hard because it was a sense of really, really wanting to be a good wife, a good mom, and putting a lot of work and a lot of effort into that endeavor. Needless to say, the romance of a very young marriage within about 5 years, when I was 22. The things that we had in common at 16 were not true by the time I was 22, so I was separated, then shortly after divorced. So here I was again, a young woman at 22 years old, raising 3 children by myself as a single parent, which then put me on a completely different path in life. There was such an element of, I don't know, a need to survive, proving myself, finding that which is good. When I look at that combination between who was that girl that fell in love with the quiet life in this Catholic school, having spiritual convictions that I really didn't have any true explanation of why I had it. It goes back to asking a question: if God is all there is and God is good, why are there starving people? Found myself raising children and questioning so many of the values that I was raised with, and so many of the things I had been taught, and the shoulds and the shouldn'ts, and what I was obligated to do and not obligated to do. So at that time, I really found myself on a spiritual search. As my oldest daughter started kindergarten, I chose a Catholic school for her. At the time, it was all over a busing issue, and I had worked 2 jobs to move my children from a grade school in a housing project where I was living when I left my first husband into a one-family house in a nice neighborhood. I worked 2 jobs to do that, and I was darned if they were going to put her on a bus and send her right back to the school I moved her out of. And I was really in that place of saying there's something not fair about this. And of course, I look at it today, it was my own personal issue, but I felt here I moved because I wanted her to be in a nicer neighborhood and a better school, and now they're going to take my little 6-year-old, put her on a bus, and cart her clear across the city in order to equalize, the schools. And while I see the need, certainly, For that, I felt personally impacted and rather resentful to the fact that they could do this to me. So into Catholic school they went. And with that, I had to volunteer for the school. Didn't have to, but it was kind of a political had to. So besides my full-time job, I was doing the school library and helping out. But really ran into some conflicts as to what I felt was true and right for me and the constraints of the religion that I was trying to focus in. And I truly started on a quest. So my first adventure into moving forward is I was working at a restaurant in Albany and had a great many Jewish friends and decided that I wanted to be Jewish. Well, I can tell you how happy my mother was when I announced that I was going to have my mikvah. We started a whole different series of things in our house, and I had studied, I had read, I had really researched, and to me the simplicity, I embraced the simplicity of a healthy mind, a healthy body. By putting my children in Catholic school, I solved the busing problem, but I began to really realize as a parent the restrictions, the ambiance, the thought patterns of the religion, the Catholic religion, which I had grown up in, and found myself really beginning to question whether I wanted my children to be raised with that same sense of guilt and the same sense of, if you will, righteousness, or that sense of what we needed to be, or never being good enough, almost as though we came into this world with original sin, and I wasn't too sure that I believed that any longer. I'm looking at my children as perfect little human beings who were truly a gift from heaven, and how could they possibly be guilty of being full of sin when they came here? So I really started to question, which put me on a quest. And that quest, my first step out at trying to begin to understand what was the spiritual calling I had. Actually, I started studying. I had a lot of Jewish friends. I worked at a restaurant in Albany and had met a lot of really fine people, and many of them Jewish, and I started studying the Jewish religion. And as I read and I studied, there was a kind of simplicity with it, a sense of taking care of the mind and the body, and living within the structure of the Golden Rule. Because the Old Testament of the Bible and in the origins of the Catholic religion are based on the early Jewish religion, it was very easy to kind of slip into that direction. So as I was going to continue studying and met with people and moving forward, as I let my family know that I was considering having my mikvah, needless to say, it caused a great big upset, to say the least. And my mother truly could not understand how her nice Catholic daughter could even consider becoming Jewish, let alone having a mikvah. But as life would have it, and since in the divine order of things, along came Pete. And Pete was my second husband, and he was a very handsome 6'2" Italian gentleman who was very, very Catholic and could not possibly embrace or understand why I would want to become Jewish. Well, love overtook common sense, and off I followed Pete down to Florida, and we got married. We moved to Florida, and I just kind of put this whole issue of religion to rest for a little while, and just was me, I guess is a good way of putting it. I no longer embraced the Catholic religion I'd been raised in, but had a lot of respect for it. My children went to public school. I was living on the beach, so it was like living in a almost vacation land, at least for me, and put things kind of on hold. It didn't last long. My daughter and my son, because of the move, there's about 18 months between their ages, both made their first communion together. So while they were in public school, they went to catechism or religious studies and made their first communion. And the priest at this particular church in Merritt Island was very, very old world and very old-fashioned, and decided to yell at all of our parents, all of the parents, that we were going to be responsible if we didn't see that our children got to confession and to communion regularly and so on. And I left shaking my head. They did make their first communion, but that was about all of that I really reached that point of, I'm not going to do this to my kids. With that, my husband, Pete's cousin, who lived in Merritt Island and was one of the reasons that we stopped by to just visit them and decided to settle there, was going to a very small church on the island, which was a Christ-Light Universal. And the pastor or minister of this church, Monakoski, who was my first teacher, had been apparently studied through the spiritualist religion and then became an independent Christian Universal Church. And she did message work, and I sat in classes, and so Lena, Pete's cousin, who was also a very nice Italian Catholic girl, actually introduced me to this first church. And as I began to study, I really began to embrace and became even more interested in the ribbon of truth that runs through all religions. I think the piece of the universal background for me truly ignited almost a fire that caused me to want to study religions and to move through that process of understanding our sameness rather than our differences, and looking at that one piece of our spiritual nature that every religion holds. Marnie was an awesome teacher. She was old when I first met her. I'm sure, of course, when you're 30, 60 seems old, but she definitely was an older woman, had white hair. She was little like I was, so that was something that always fascinated me with her. And she almost danced down. We'd go from the back of the meeting hall, really, because we didn't have a church, but she would go from the back of the building to the front to go up to the podium to speak on Sunday, and she always wore a flowing kind of white dress, and she would walk up the aisle to the church, and it looked like she would float there. But the classes in understanding our spiritual nature, in understanding that which moves beyond the senses, and basically back in this was the early 70s, so this was around 72, they just referred to them as psychic development classes. And they were not religious in nature, nor did they denote becoming anything with religion, but they certainly worked from that premise that we're all divine, unique beings, and that each of us are capable of turning into our psychic senses. So this marvelous lady truly was my very first mentor and teacher. So I took classes for about 2 years with her. And again, life takes many strange turns, because at this particular time, as I was taking classes with Monakoski and beginning to understand more about myself, my sensitivity, learning to embrace it rather than feeling that I shouldn't be so sensitive. If I had a penny for every time someone's told me I shouldn't be so sensitive, I'd be so wealthy that I probably could move myself into a well-known status among the wealthy, the young and the wealthy, or at least the old and the wealthy. My name is the Reverend Donna Riegel, and it's my pleasure to be here today with you.